A young black girl's moment of triumph turned into a battle for dignity when her rightfully earned seat was brazenly stolen by a white passenger who refused to acknowledge her ticket. Black girl CEO's seat, stolen by white passenger, would soon become the headline that sparked nationwide outrage, as the events that unfolded in that pressurized cabin forced an entire aircraft to remain grounded. The confrontation that followed would expose deep-seated prejudices within corporate America and the airline industry, ultimately changing protocols and challenging assumptions about what power looks like in the 21st century. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. As the jetway filled with the hum of boarding passengers, Zoe Carter strode confidently down the aisle of the Boeing 737, her father Marcus following closely behind. At just 13 years old, Zoe was already making waves as the youngest CEO in the tech industry, her educational app MindSpark having attracted millions in venture capital. She glanced down at her boarding pass, seat 2A, window seat in first class. A small luxury she'd grown accustomed to during her frequent speaking engagements across the country. But as she approached row 2, her confident stride faltered. A stern-faced white man in his 50s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit with a silk pocket square, was sprawled across her assigned seat, his leather briefcase occupying the adjacent space. "Excuse me," Zoe said politely, holding out her boarding pass. "I believe you're in my seat." The man barely glanced up from his phone, his eyes flicking dismissively over her bright yellow blazer and natural hair styled in 2 puffs. Around them, other passengers slowed their boarding, the narrow aisle becoming congested as the awkward confrontation unfolded. Zoe felt heat rising to her cheeks as the man continued ignoring her, deliberately scrolling through emails as though she were invisible. Marcus stepped forward, placing a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Sir, my daughter has been assigned seat 2A. Would you mind checking your boarding pass?" The request, though polite, carried the firm tone of a father who'd witnessed his child's accomplishments repeatedly questioned and undermined. The man, who they would later learn was Thomas Sterling, CFO of a pharmaceutical company, finally looked up, his expression hardening as he took in the father-daughter pair standing expectantly beside him. "This is first class, not daycare," Sterling replied, his voice dripping with condescension. There must be some mistake." He made no move to retrieve his own boarding pass, instead settling more firmly into the plush leather seat and turning toward the window. The flight attendant organizing welcome drinks paused her routine, sensing the brewing conflict. Around them, the curious stares of other passengers created an invisible pressure, the weight of public scrutiny that Zoe had felt countless times before in boardrooms and conferences where she was always the youngest, and often the only black person present. The sympathetic flight attendant, a woman named Melissa with 15 years of experience written in the fine lines around her eyes, approached their row. Her navy uniform was impeccably pressed, her smile professional yet tinged with concern as she glanced between Zoe and the man who'd commandeered her seat. "May I see both your boarding passes, please?" Melissa asked, her voice carrying just enough authority to cut through the tension. Zoe handed over her ticket without hesitation. The man, Thomas, according to the name he'd grudgingly shared when asked, made a show of retrieving his from an expensive leather wallet. As he passed it to Melissa, he tapped the platinum status emblem prominently displayed. "I always take this seat on this route," Thomas said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I'm here every Tuesday. There must be some mistake with your system." He glanced at Zoe dismissively. "I'm sure there's another seat available for her elsewhere." Melissa compared both documents carefully, her expression neutral. Several passengers nearby had gone quiet, sensing the brewing confrontation. The boarding process had momentarily stalled. "Sir," Melissa began, her politeness unwavering but her spine visibly straightening. "Seat 2A is assigned to Ms. Carter today. Your ticket shows you're in seat 12C, which is in our Economy Plus section." Thomas's face flushed. "Do you know how many miles I fly with this airline annually?" "I understand you're a valued customer, sir," Melissa responded. "But I need to ask you to please return to your assigned seat so we can complete boarding and depart on schedule." Murmurs rippled through the first-class cabin. Zoe noticed several passengers discreetly lifting their phones, recording the interaction. One woman 2 rows ahead caught Zoe's eye and gave a small nod of solidarity. Thomas remained planted in the seat, his jaw set stubbornly. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor." "I can arrange that," Melissa replied evenly, "but I'll need you to move to your assigned seat first. We have 178 other passengers waiting to reach their destinations today." The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed. What had begun as a routine boarding process had become something extraordinary, a public standoff that everyone sensed would not end quietly. Zoe stood her ground, clutching her designer briefcase, aware that this moment was quickly becoming bigger than just a disputed seat. Marcus Carter stepped forward, his presence calm but commanding, placing a steady hand on Zoe's shoulder. "There's no negotiation here. My daughter's seat was purchased and confirmed. Please move," he said, voice low but resolute. The businessman's jaw visibly tightened, his knuckles whitening around his leather briefcase handle. He made a show of checking his watch, a gleaming Rolex that caught the cabin light, before responding with practiced condescension. "Look, I understand you're upset, but I've got an important meeting in Chicago. Surely your daughter can sit somewhere else just this once." His eyes never quite met Marcus's. Instead, scanning the growing audience of passengers who had paused their boarding to watch the confrontation unfold. The flight attendant hovered nearby, her professional smile straining under the weight of the escalating situation. Marcus straightened to his full 6'2" height, his tailored suit accentuating shoulders built from years of military service before his corporate career. "My daughter is the CEO of Carter Innovations. She has meetings too. The difference is, she respects other people's space and property." A murmur rippled through the onlooking passengers. The businessman's eyes widened slightly as he reassessed Zoe, taking in her professional attire and the quiet confidence beneath her obvious frustration. The standoff deepened, eyes locked and neither side yielding, as the tension in the cabin mounted to a breaking point. Zoe could feel her pulse pounding, determined not to let humiliation steal her composure. She'd faced boardroom battles and hostile takeover attempts with less anxiety than this public confrontation. An older woman 3 rows back called out, "Just give the girl her seat. We all want to get moving." Several passengers nodded in agreement. The businessman's face flushed red, caught between pride and the growing social pressure. The flight attendant stepped closer, her voice firmer now. "Sir, I've verified the seat assignments. You're in 23C, not B. Please take your assigned seat so we can complete boarding." For one tense moment, Zoe thought he might refuse. His eyes darted between her face, her father's unwavering stance, and the increasingly impatient passengers behind them. Finally, with a dismissive snort, he gathered his belongings. "Fine, make a federal case out of it," he muttered, sliding out of the seat and brushing past them toward his actual assignment. The captain's voice crackled through the cabin speakers with unmistakable authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to a passenger disturbance, we will be returning to the gate. Security personnel will be boarding the aircraft to resolve the situation. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The announcement landed like a bomb in the pressurized cabin. Passengers exchanged worried glances as the massive jet shuddered and began its slow pivot back toward the terminal. The usual white noise of conversation evaporated, replaced by an anxious silence punctuated only by whispers and the occasional ping of a call button. Zoe remained frozen in the aisle, her boarding pass clutched so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. She could feel tears welling up, blurring her vision, but she blinked them back fiercely. This wasn't about crying. This was about standing her ground. The familiar heat of humiliation warmed her cheeks, but something else burned hotter. Determination. She'd worked too hard building her company from nothing to be dismissed by someone who couldn't even be bothered to check his seat assignment. From nearby seats, passengers began recording with their phones. A middle-aged woman 3 rows back caught Zoe's eye and gave her a subtle nod of solidarity. The flight attendant, who had initially tried to mediate, now stood at the front of the cabin, speaking urgently into a phone. The man in Zoe's seat had gone quiet, his previous bluster replaced by a dawning realization that his actions had escalated beyond his control. His companion whispered something in his ear, and he shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with anyone. "This is ridiculous," someone muttered from the back. "Mud, we're going to miss our connections." Zoe felt a momentary pang of guilt. All these people delayed because of what had started with her seat. But she quickly pushed it aside. She hadn't caused this situation. The man's entitlement and subsequent refusal to follow basic airplane protocol had triggered this chain reaction. Now, as the aircraft slowly taxied back to the terminal, there was no stopping what would come next. Through the window, Zoe could already see the flashing lights of airport security vehicles waiting on the tarmac. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would be completely out of her hands. The security officers moved with practiced efficiency, their blue uniforms parting the sea of curious onlookers as they made their way down the aisle. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man with salt and pepper hair, positioned himself beside row 3, his expression professionally neutral. The purser stood slightly behind, clipboard in hand, her earlier hesitation now replaced with resolute determination. "Sir, ma'am, we need to see both of your boarding passes, please," the officer stated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Thomas's face, already pink from the confrontation, deepened to a crimson shade that reached the tips of his ears. His fingers trembled slightly as he retrieved his boarding pass from his jacket pocket, the paper crinkling under his tight grip. Zoe produced hers with calm dignity, though her pulse raced beneath her composed exterior. The officer examined both documents, his eyes flicking between the papers and seat numbers. "Sir, your assigned seat is 12C, Economy Plus section." A collective murmur rippled through the first-class cabin. Thomas's mouth opened, then closed, like a fish suddenly finding itself on dry land. The indignation in his eyes morphed briefly to panic before hardening into something uglier. "There must be some mistake," he sputtered, but his protest withered under the officer's unwavering gaze. "No mistake, sir. Please gather your belongings and proceed to your assigned seat." With jerky movements, Thomas collected his laptop and carry-on, his shoulders hunched with humiliation. As he rose, he leaned close to Zoe, his voice low, but perfectly audible in the hushed cabin. "You'll regret this. People like you don't belong up here." The words hung in the air, sharp and venomous. Several passengers gasped. The security officer stepped forward, his posture stiffening. "Sir, that's enough. Move to your seat now." A chill swept through the cabin as Thomas finally retreated down the aisle, the back of his neck burning red. Zoe slid into her rightful place, the luxurious leather seat still warm from his unwelcome occupation. She placed her hands on the armrests, claiming her territory, but beneath her composed exterior, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The seat was hers, the victory clear, but Thomas's parting words had left an invisible stain on what should have been a moment of vindication. Thomas shuffled down the aisle with his shoulders hunched, clutching his carry-on bag like a shield. His face burned with humiliation as passengers' eyes followed him. Just as he reached the economy section, an elegant, silver-haired woman in her 60s stood up from her first-class seat. "Sir, she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "I'm Evelyn Hayes. Would you consider taking my seat instead?" The cabin fell silent as passengers craned their necks to watch. Thomas paused, confusion replacing the anger on his face. Evelyn approached him with dignified steps, her pearl necklace catching the overhead lights. "Perhaps a change of perspective is what you need today," she said, her tone gentle but with an unmistakable firmness beneath the politeness. Her eyes, wise from decades of witnessing similar situations, held his gaze steadily. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, weighing his options. The alternative was trudging to economy with everyone watching. Thank you," he finally muttered, unable to refuse without looking even worse. As Evelyn gathered her belongings, Thomas couldn't help glancing back toward Zoe and Marcus. He shot them a final glare, attempting to salvage some dignity, but the damage was done. Zoe met his gaze evenly, neither triumphant nor apologetic, simply resolute. As Thomas settled into Evelyn's vacated seat, he arranged his features into what he hoped was an expression of someone who'd received an upgrade rather than charity. But beneath this carefully constructed facade, something toxic was brewing. The public correction, the flight attendant's intervention, and now this woman's pointed kindness, each moment compounded into a growing knot of resentment. He pulled out his phone, fingers trembling slightly as he navigated to social media. Someone would hear about this injustice. Someone would understand his side. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Thomas didn't notice Evelyn settling comfortably into her new economy seat, exchanging pleasant smiles with her neighbors. She'd given up her premium spot without hesitation, but had planted something far more valuable, the seeds of a lesson that Thomas wasn't yet ready to learn. Zoe tried to focus on her breathing as the plane taxied toward the runway. The presentation materials for tomorrow's pitch were stored safely in her tablet, but her mind refused to cooperate. Instead of rehearsing key points about market penetration and projected revenue streams, all she could see was Thomas's face, that look of entitlement when he'd taken her seat, the flash of indignation when confronted. Her fingers tapped nervously against the armrest. "You did nothing wrong," Marcus whispered, placing his hand gently over hers. "Remember who you are. You're Zoe Washington, the woman who built a 7-figure company from scratch, the woman who's about to land the biggest contract of her career. Don't let some random guy with boundary issues take up space in your head." She nodded, grateful for his steadying presence. "I know. It's just, I'm tired of always having to prove I belong in spaces like this." The plane accelerated, pressing them back into their seats. Through the window, the airport lights blurred into streaks of gold against the darkening sky. Zoe closed her eyes, willing herself to compartmentalize. San Francisco, the pitch, the potential investors. That's where her energy needed to go. But 6 rows behind them, Thomas Whitfield seethed. The bourbon he'd ordered hadn't dulled his anger. It had crystallized it. He scrolled through his phone, pausing at the corporate headshot of Zoe he'd found after a quick search. So she was some hotshot CEO. That explained the attitude. People like her always thought they were special, always hiding behind policies and procedures when it suited them. He took another swig of his drink, ignoring the flight attendant's gentle reminder to stow electronic devices for takeoff. The plane continued its acceleration, but Thomas's thoughts raced faster. This wasn't over. He'd been embarrassed, and someone needed to answer for that. The woman thought she'd won by having him removed from her precious seat, but there were other ways to even the score. As the aircraft lifted off the ground, Thomas opened his notes app and began typing furiously. By the time they reached cruising altitude, he had drafted 3 separate emails, one to the airline's customer service, one to their corporate headquarters, and one that would need just a few more details before he sent it to Zoe's company board. Midway through the flight, Thomas disappeared into the lavatory, phone clutched tightly in his sweaty palm. His reflection in the tiny mirror showed a man consumed by wounded pride and festering resentment. The cramped space felt oddly comforting, a private booth from which to launch his counterattack. He locked the door with a decisive click. With trembling fingers, he dialed a number few civilians knew existed, a confidential airline security hotline reserved for reporting in-flight threats. Thomas had obtained it years ago through an industry contact, never imagining he'd actually use it. His heart hammered against his ribs as the line connected. "The security operations," answered a clipped old professional voice. "Yes, hello," Thomas whispered, injecting urgency into his tone. "I need to report a passenger on Flight 473 to Chicago. Seat 1A. The woman is traveling under false pretenses." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "I have reason to believe her documentation is forged and she's involved in financial fraud." "Can you elaborate, sir?" The operator's voice sharpened with interest. Thomas closed his eyes, crossing a moral line he'd never imagined breaching. "She's posing as a CEO, but her behavior has been erratic. I overheard her on a call discussing moving large sums offshore." The lies flowed easily now. When confronted, she became hostile and threatening. "Your name and seat number, sir." "I'd rather not say. I'm concerned for my safety if she identifies me." Another lie. "Please, just check her credentials thoroughly when we land." "Something isn't right." Thomas ended the call, a cold satisfaction settling in his chest. He knew exactly what would happen. Zoe would be detained upon landing, subjected to humiliating questioning while her identity and position were verified. By the time the misunderstanding was cleared up, she'd have missed her connection and whatever important meeting awaited her. A fitting punishment for the woman who dared to expose his entitlement. What Thomas couldn't anticipate was how quickly his venomous plan would spiral beyond his control, or how thoroughly it would backfire. The plane had barely reached cruising altitude when the captain's voice crackled through the speakers, unusually tense. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a security issue that requires our immediate attention and must divert to Oakland International Airport for investigation. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." The announcement landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of alarm through the cabin. Passengers exchanged worried glances, some whispering theories about what could be happening. Zoe felt the weight of several stares suddenly directed at her, including one particularly accusatory glare from the flight attendant who had earlier sided with Karen. "Did you see how that flight attendant just looked at me?" Zoe whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "They think I'm the security issue, don't they?" Marcus reached across the armrest and took his daughter's hand, his grip firm and reassuring. His jaw was set in determination, though Zoe could see the concern flickering behind his eyes. "Listen to me, Zoe. You've done absolutely nothing wrong. This is exactly the kind of situation we've talked about, where people make assumptions based on nothing but their own prejudices." As the plane began its unexpected descent toward Oakland, the atmosphere in the cabin grew increasingly tense. A young man across the aisle was filming discreetly with his phone. An elderly couple whispered while stealing glances at Zoe. Even the businessman who had earlier voiced support now seemed to be reconsidering his position. His expression troubled as he stared out the window. "Dad, everyone's looking at me like I'm some kind of threat," Zoe said, her voice barely audible. The weight of those stares made her shrink into her seat, a lifetime of similar experiences suddenly compounding in this pressurized cabin. Marcus squeezed her hand tighter. "Stay strong, Zoe. We'll face this together. Remember who you are. You're the CEO who earned her seat at every table she's ever sat at. This one included." His voice carried the quiet strength that had always been her foundation. As the plane banked sharply toward Oakland, Zoe took a deep breath and straightened her spine. Whatever was waiting for them on the ground, she wouldn't face it cowering. The plane descended through clouds, and for a moment Zoe caught sight of her reflection in the window, scared but resolute. Whatever was about to happen, she would meet it head-on, with the dignity her father had taught her to maintain, even in the face of injustice. The plane had barely touched down when the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The usual post-landing shuffle halted as two uniformed federal agents appeared at the front of the cabin, their expressions unreadable. Zoe's stomach dropped when one of them consulted a tablet and called out, "Zoe Carter, please identify yourself." Every head turned in her direction. Zoe raised a trembling hand, feeling the weight of dozens of stares. The flight attendant who had earlier defended her now looked concerned as she pointed the agents toward Zoe's row. "Miss Carter, we need you to come with us, please," the taller agent said, his voice carrying through the now silent cabin. "Bring your personal belongings." Marcus immediately unbuckled his seatbelt. "I'm coming with her." "Sir, this doesn't concern you," the second agent replied. "She's my colleague and friend. I'm not letting her go alone." Marcus's voice was firm, brooking no argument. The businessman who had watched the earlier confrontation nodded approvingly. Zoe gathered her laptop bag with shaking hands. The walk down the aisle felt interminable, with passengers whispering and filming on their phones. Karen smirked as Zoe passed, but the triumph in her eyes faltered when Marcus followed closely behind. Outside on the jetway, a woman in a dark suit waited, her badge displayed prominently. "Miss Carter, I'm Agent Dana Miller, Department of Homeland Security." Her eyes flicked between Zoe and Marcus. "And you are Marcus Washington, Chief Financial Officer of Horizon Tech. Whatever this is about, I'm staying with Miss Carter." Agent Miller's expression remained neutral. "Miss Carter, your travel credentials and business records have been called into question. We need to verify everything immediately." "Questioned by whom?" Zoe asked, finding her voice at last. "We received an urgent report about potential corporate identity fraud," Agent Miller replied, consulting her notes. "The complainant alleged you were impersonating a company executive and using falsified credentials." Marcus stepped forward. "That's absurd. Zoe is our chief executive officer. I can verify her identity right now." Zoe felt a chill run through her body. Someone had reported her, and she knew exactly who. Through the jetway window, she could see other passengers beginning to disembark, Karen among them, deliberately avoiding looking in their direction. Agent Miller's eyes narrowed as she flipped through the stack of documents Marcus had provided. Zoe sat across from her, hands clasped tightly in her lap, watching as the agent's expression gradually shifted from suspicion to something more contemplative. The sterile airport office, with its harsh fluorescent lighting and government-issue furniture, felt like a pressure cooker. "So you're telling me," Agent Miller said slowly, "that you're not only the legitimate CEO of Neurotech, but you're here to meet with Blackstone Ventures about a 7-figure investment round." She tapped her pen against the company financial reports, quarterly projections, and board meeting minutes that Marcus had meticulously organized. Marcus nodded, pulling up additional files on his tablet. "Everything's here. Audit reports from last quarter, the email chain setting up today's meeting, even the presentation Zoe was planning to give." He slid the tablet across the desk. "Neurotech's valuation has tripled under her leadership in 18 months. Agent Miller scrolled through the materials, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal genuine interest. "And this neural interface technology, it's your design." "My patent," Zoe confirmed, her voice steadier now. "Filed 3 years ago when I was still at MIT." The door swung open with purpose, and a woman in a crisp charcoal suit strode in, radiating controlled fury. "I'm Priya Desai, Miss Washington's attorney," she announced, placing her briefcase on the table with a decisive thud. "And I need to inform everyone that what happened today wasn't random." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Priya pulled out a folder. "This incident matches 6 others in the past 14 months. all involving minority founders of promising tech startups, all occurring just before major investment meetings. She laid out photographs, news clippings, and legal documents in a damning timeline. Each founder was delayed, detained, or otherwise prevented from making critical presentations. "You're suggesting this was coordinated?" Agent Miller asked, her professional detachment cracking. Priya nodded grimly. "We've traced a connection to Orion Corporation, a tech conglomerate that's been acquiring distressed startups after their funding rounds mysteriously fall through." She pointed to a document. "The passenger who took Ms. Washington's seat. He's a contractor for Orion's security division." Zoe felt a chill run through her body. "They wanted me to miss my meeting." "Not just miss it," Priya corrected. "They wanted you publicly humiliated, your reputation damaged, and your company vulnerable." She turned to Agent Miller. "This isn't just harassment, it's corporate sabotage with disturbing racial targeting." Priya reached into her briefcase and pulled out a sleek tablet. With a few deft swipes, she opened a digital dossier and handed it to Agent Miller. "This isn't just about a seat," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It's about power, prejudice, and fear of what Zoe represents." The agent's eyes widened as she scrolled through meticulously organized documents, financial records, and intercepted communications. The evidence painted a damning picture. Thomas Sterling wasn't merely an entitled businessman, but a key operative in Orion Corporation's systematic campaign to eliminate competition. "We've been tracking Sterling for months," Priya explained. "He specifically targets promising startups led by women of color. Zoe's company has been on their radar since she secured that government contract." The documents revealed a pattern: strategic harassment, planted negative press, manipulated stock prices, and even orchestrated accidents that befell several entrepreneurs who posed threats to Orion's market dominance. "Look at this communication from 3 days ago." Priya pointed to a particular email. Sterling was instructed to handle the Lewis situation before the Tokyo presentation. They knew exactly where she'd be today. Agent Miller's expression hardened as she continued reading. The dossier connected Sterling to 5 previous incidents involving promising entrepreneurs who subsequently lost major deals or were forced to sell their companies at devastating losses. "How did you obtain all this?" Miller asked, professional skepticism evident in her tone. "I head cybersecurity at Pinnacle Ventures," Priya replied. "We invest in Zoe's company. When she started receiving unusual threats, we initiated protective monitoring. What we found led us much deeper than we anticipated. The most disturbing document was a strategic assessment of Zoe Tech, which Sterling's team had labeled Priority Target Elimination Phase. It detailed plans to systematically destroy Zoe's reputation, business relationships, and eventually force her company into bankruptcy." Agent Miller's eyes narrowed, realization dawning across her face. She handed the tablet back to Priya and straightened her jacket. "This goes well beyond an airplane incident," she said, her voice dropping to a professional whisper. "I'm escalating this immediately. We'll need formal statements from everyone." She pulled out her phone and stepped slightly away to make a call. When she returned, her demeanor had shifted from investigative to resolute. "Ms. Sharma, Ms. Lewis," she addressed them both, "I'm bringing in a specialized team. What you've uncovered appears to connect to several open investigations. I promise you, we will hold those responsible accountable." Thomas was still riding high on his perceived victory when his phone buzzed. The caller ID displayed Orion Legal, and he answered with a smug smile that quickly vanished. The voice on the other end was tight with barely controlled panic. "The FBI is involved now, Thomas. They're calling it a potential hate crime with corporate conspiracy elements." "What the hell were you thinking?" His throat went dry. "I was protecting our interests, just like—" "No, you've gone too far. The board is in emergency session right now." The lawyer's voice dropped to a harsh whisper. They're already discussing how to distance the company from your actions. Thomas felt the ground shift beneath him. The corner office, the executive perks, the power he'd wielded just hours ago. It was all evaporating. But I was acting on directives. The acquisition strategy. Don't be naive. There's nothing in writing connecting your actions to any official company strategy. You know how this works. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't an indispensable executive. He was a pawn, expendable, sacrificial when necessary. They can't just throw me under the bus, Thomas protested, his voice rising. And I've given 15 years to Orion, and they'll give you a generous severance if you take full responsibility. Otherwise, the threat hung unspoken. Thomas ended the call and stared out his office window at the city skyline. The empire he'd helped build, the power structure he'd defended so zealously, it was all a mirage. His hands trembled as he loosened his tie. Desperation clawed at his carefully maintained composure. He'd triggered consequences he never anticipated. The racist incident on the plane wasn't supposed to become national news. The target wasn't supposed to be someone with influence. The plan wasn't supposed to leave evidence. His computer pinged with an email notification. Subject line, "Meeting with board, 4 p.m. today." The timestamp showed it had been sent to him and him alone. Thomas reached for the crystal tumbler on his desk, pouring 3 fingers of bourbon. As the amber liquid burned down his throat, he realized something fundamental was changing. The corporate fortress he'd believed would protect him was instead preparing to excise him like a tumor. Outside his office, he could hear the usual bustle of corporate life continuing, oblivious to his impending downfall. But beneath that normalcy, he sensed hairline fractures forming in Orion's carefully constructed facade. His actions hadn't just endangered his career. They had started to expose the rot at the foundation of the entire operation. The FBI field office buzzed with activity when Evelyn Hayes walked through the doors. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes held unwavering determination. She approached the front desk, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I need to speak with whoever is handling the Orion Technologies investigation," she stated. "And I have information that will be crucial to your case." Within minutes, Evelyn found herself seated in a conference room, surrounded by 3 agents who regarded her with measured curiosity. She took a deep breath before speaking. "My name is Evelyn Hayes. Until 3 months ago, I was Senior Vice President of Competitive Strategy at Orion Technologies." She placed a small black USB drive on the table. And I've been documenting their illegal activities for the past 18 months. The lead agent leaned forward. "What exactly are we looking at here, Ms. Hayes?" "Everything," Evelyn replied. "Internal memos, financial records, recorded meetings. Orion isn't just targeting Zoe Washington's company. They've systematically undermined at least 7 promising startups in the last 2 years alone." As the agents plugged in the drive, Evelyn explained how she'd gradually discovered Orion's tactics, corporate espionage, targeted harassment campaigns, and strategic manipulation of investors. "They call it market correction," she said bitterly, "but it's nothing more than predatory elimination of competition. They specifically target companies led by women and minorities, anyone they consider undeserving of success." One agent scrolled through documents, eyes widening. "This is incomprehensive. I started collecting evidence when I realized what was happening. The final straw was when I discovered their plans for Zoe's company. They were willing to go further than ever before." Evelyn's voice cracked slightly. "I couldn't be complicit anymore." The room fell silent as the agents absorbed the magnitude of what she'd brought them. The evidence was damning, detailed plans to sabotage Zoe's pitch, plant negative stories in tech publications, and even arrange the airport confrontation to publicly humiliate her. "You understand the risk you're taking by coming forward?" the lead agent asked. Evelyn nodded. "I do, But someone has to stop them. These young founders, they deserve a fair chance. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The FBI operation moved with unprecedented speed. Within 48 hours of Evelyn's testimony, agents had seized documents from Orion's headquarters and raided 3 executive homes. Priya, who hadn't slept more than 4 hours since the flight incident, coordinated with authorities while keeping Zoe and her father informed of every development. "They're building an airtight case," she explained during a late-night call. Evelyn's testimony was the key that unlocked everything. Zoe listened to these updates with quiet intensity. She sat cross-legged on her living room floor, sketching circuit designs in her notebook, a habit that had always calmed her mind. Her father brought her hot chocolate and squeezed her shoulder. "You doing okay, kiddo?" She nodded slowly. "I'm just processing. It's weird to think that standing up for my seat on a plane somehow led to all this." The tech world was in absolute turmoil. Orion's stock had dropped 27% in a single day as rumors of corporate espionage and discrimination lawsuits spread. Industry forums and social media platforms buzzed with speculation. The story of the teenage CEO who had been disrespected on a flight but ultimately exposed corruption at one of tech's most established companies had captured public imagination. "Your inbox is overflowing with interview requests," her father mentioned. CNN, MSNBC, even international outlets. "I don't want to talk to anyone yet," Zoe replied. "And not until this is finished." What amazed her most was the outpouring of support. Hundreds of young black entrepreneurs had shared their own stories of discrimination using Stand with Zoe. 3 major tech companies had publicly denounced Orion and severed partnership agreements. Even some of Orion's own employees had resigned in protest, with one senior engineer writing a scathing open letter about the company's toxic culture. Zoe's phone buzzed with a text from Priya. "Just heard from FBI. They're moving to formal charges tomorrow. You did it." She showed the message to her father, who smiled with pride but also concern. "This is just the beginning of a long fight," he cautioned. "I know," Zoe replied, closing her notebook, "but at least now we're fighting on even ground." That night, Zoe was reviewing her notes when a soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Opening her hotel room door, she found Thomas standing there, his face drawn and remorseful, eyes rimmed with red. The confidence he'd displayed on the plane had vanished completely. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to talk to you." Zoe hesitated before stepping aside. Thomas entered, his shoulders slumped under the weight of whatever had brought him here. "I've made terrible mistakes," he admitted after a long silence. His hands trembled as he placed a thick manila folder on the coffee table between them. "These are internal Orion documents, financial reports, emails, meeting minutes, everything you need to expose what they've been doing, what I've been helping them do." Zoe glanced at the folder but didn't reach for it. "Why now?" "Because I saw myself today, truly saw what I've become." Thomas ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "When I took your seat, when I spoke to you that way, I was just following orders, playing my part, but watching you stand your ground with such dignity while His voice cracked. "I can't live with what I've done anymore." Zoe studied him carefully, years of business instinct, helping her search his eyes for sincerity. The documents could be game-changing, but only if Thomas was genuine. "You understand what this means?" she asked. "If these documents say what you claim, Orion will come after you with everything they have." Thomas nodded. "I know, but maybe this is how I start making things right." Zoe leaned forward, her voice quiet but firm. "Redemption is possible, Thomas, but only if you stand for what's right. These papers help, but they're not enough. Will you testify? Will you tell your story publicly?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Thomas stared at his hands, the weight of his decision visible in every line of his face. "If I do this," he whispered, "as there's no going back." "No," Zoe agreed, "but sometimes the only way forward is through the fire." Thomas nodded, tears glinting in his eyes. "I will." His voice was barely audible, a whisper of remorse floating between them. He gathered his belongings with shaking hands and walked away, shoulders slumped under the weight of his actions. Zoe watched him leave, a strange mixture of anger, relief, and hope swirling inside her. The man who had been her fiercest adversary might now become an unexpected ally in the fight for justice. The thought was both unsettling and comforting. That night, Zoe barely slept. She rehearsed her presentation until the words blurred together, while Marcus fine-tuned their financial projections. "We've got this," he reassured her, squeezing her hand as dawn broke through the hotel curtains. "They need to see the real you, the visionary they should have recognized from the beginning." By 8:30 the next morning, they stood outside the conference room at Westbrook Investments. Zoe straightened her blazer, the same one she'd worn on the flight that had changed everything. "Ready?" Marcus asked, his eyes reflecting confidence she was struggling to feel. "As I'll ever be," she replied, taking a deep breath. They entered to find 5 people seated around a polished table, 3 men and 2 women, all wearing expressions of cautious skepticism. The oldest, a silver-haired woman with piercing blue eyes, spoke first. "Ms. Johnson, your company has been in the headlines for reasons unrelated to your technology. Why should we separate the controversy from our investment decision?" Zoe placed her hands flat on the table, steadying herself. "Because what happened on that flight is precisely why my company matters. Bias recognition software isn't just a product, it's a necessity, and I'm not just its creator, I'm living proof of why we need it." She launched into her presentation, her voice growing stronger with each slide, each data point, each real-world application. Marcus watched the investors' faces shift from skepticism to interest. When Zoe demonstrated the live prototype, showing how it could flag potential discrimination in real-time decision-making processes, the youngest investor leaned forward, clearly impressed. "The incident that made headlines," Zoe continued, "that wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about who gets to occupy spaces of power and who gets questioned when they do. My company offers a solution that makes those biases visible before they cause harm." The silver-haired woman nodded slowly, her pen tapping thoughtfully against her notepad. "And your financial projections?" Marcus stepped forward, ready to present the numbers that would determine whether Zoe's vision survived or crashed. The room felt charged with possibility, balanced on the knife edge between failure and breakthrough. The investors' eyes widened as Zoe commanded the presentation with unwavering confidence. Slide after slide, she revealed DreamLink's exponential growth curves, their impact on underserved communities, and most importantly, their transparent business practices that stood in stark contrast to Orion's shadowy operations. "Our user acquisition cost is 40% lower than industry standard, while our retention rate exceeds 68%, she explained, her voice steady despite the pressure. "And these aren't just numbers. They represent real people finding opportunities they never had access to before." When the skeptical questions came, and they did, particularly from those with existing Orion relationships, Zoe didn't flinch. She addressed each concern with precise data and authentic passion, never once appearing defensive or unprepared. "Let me be perfectly clear," she said, looking directly at the most doubtful faces in the room. These coordinated attacks against our company aren't about legitimate business concerns. They're proof of exactly how much the established players fear new voices disrupting their comfortable monopoly. They're terrified of what happens when someone like me builds something better." The room fell silent. Then Marcus Blackwood, a notoriously tough venture capitalist, leaned forward. "I've been in this industry 30 years, Miss Washington. I've never seen a founder handle this kind of pressure with such grace and competence. One by one, the investors began nodding. What had started as a defensive meeting had transformed into something else entirely, a rallying point. Zoe hadn't just survived the crisis, she'd turned it into an opportunity to showcase exactly why DreamLink deserved their support. "We're not just offering capital," said Blackwood, looking around at his colleagues. "We're prepared to issue a joint statement supporting DreamLink and condemning these underhanded tactics. This industry needs innovation, not intimidation." By meeting's end, Zoe had secured not only the funding round, but something far more valuable, a united front of powerful allies willing to stand publicly against Orion's tactics. As she gathered her materials, Zoe caught Jessica's eye across the room. Her mentor gave her the smallest nod, but in it was unmistakable pride. The FBI raid on Orion's headquarters dominated every news outlet. Tech giant toppled by child CEO's bravery flashed across screens nationwide as agents carried out boxes of evidence. The operation had been meticulously planned after Thomas and Evelyn provided their bombshell testimony. Their detailed accounts of corporate espionage, sabotage, and the systematic targeting of Zoe's company left federal prosecutors with an airtight case. One by one, Orion executives were led away in handcuffs, their faces splashed across social media and news sites, their reputations in tatters. "I still can't believe we did it," Zoe whispered, curled up on her living room sofa beside Marcus as they watched the coverage unfold. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from supporters, investors, and even former critics now eager to align themselves with the victorious underdog. Marcus squeezed her hand. "You did it. You stood your ground when anyone else would have given up." The industry's darkest secrets spilled into public view as whistleblowers, emboldened by Zoe's courage, came forward with their own stories. The pattern was undeniable. Systematic suppression of innovations from minority-owned startups, backdoor deals, and coordinated efforts to maintain the status quo of the tech world's power structure. "They're calling for congressional hearings now," Marcus noted, pointing to the scrolling ticker at the bottom of the screen. "This is going beyond just Orion." Zoe nodded, still processing the magnitude of what had transpired. What had begun as a simple flight and an entitled passenger's behavior had cascaded into a reckoning that was reshaping the entire technology landscape. Her algorithm, now protected and recognized as revolutionary, was attracting ethical investment partners who shared her vision of technology that served humanity rather than exploiting it. "My mum called earlier," Zoe said softly. "She told me my great-grandmother would have been proud." Her eyes welled with tears. She fought different battles in her time, but she always said that standing up matters even when you're afraid. Outside, reporters still camped at the end of her driveway, hoping for a statement from the young CEO who had brought down a giant, but tonight was for quiet reflection. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more opportunities, more responsibility. For every underestimated innovator watching this unfold, the message was clear. The path might be harder, but the future was wide open. "Ready for what comes next?" Marcus asked. Zoe smiled, her confidence no longer fragile but tempered by fire. "More than ready." Zoe stood before the packed auditorium, the DreamLink logo glowing behind her as hundreds of attendees hung on her every word. The journey from that fateful flight to this moment had transformed her in ways she never imagined. She adjusted the microphone, her confidence no longer something she needed to prove. It radiated naturally from within. 3 months ago, I was removed from my seat on a plane because someone couldn't believe a black woman belonged in first class, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. Today, I stand before you as that same black woman, launching a platform that will connect dreamers across every boundary and barrier. Murmurs of support rippled through the crowd. Marcus sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Beside him was Zoe's parents, her mentor, Elaine, and, surprisingly, Captain Reynolds, who had kept his promise to support her after that day. Even more surprising was the airline's new diversity director, hired as part of their settlement, nodding along to Zoe's words. "If a single act of prejudice can spark a revolution, then let us always choose courage over fear," she declared, her voice steady, her dreams undimmed. Dreamlink isn't just about connecting entrepreneurs to resources. It's about ensuring that no one's potential is dismissed because of how they look. The thunderous applause that followed felt like validation, not just for her business, but for her refusal to stay silent. The standing ovation brought tears to her eyes, but she blinked them back. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Later, as champagne flowed and investors eagerly lined up to speak with her, Zoe took a moment alone by the window. She thought about that woman on the plane, wondering if she ever realized how her actions had inadvertently launched something powerful. The lawsuit settlement had provided seed funding, but the publicity had opened doors Zoe hadn't known existed. Her phone buzzed with a notification. Another 1,000 users had signed up during her speech alone. She smiled, remembering her grandmother's words, "Sometimes the world pushes you down just so you can rise up higher." As she rejoined the celebration, surrounded by allies, driven by purpose, and forever changed by the power of justice, Zoe knew her journey was only beginning, and this time nobody would be taking her seat.